us about how Angola is opening the door in terms of regulatory reform to provide opportunities. So this time, we turn our attention to East Africa. It's unlocking its own opportunities through discovery. And to take us into the story of East Africa, we're joined now by Felicia Winter of TGS, who will share why East Africa remains one of the world's most promising oil and gas frontiers, with vast offshore gas resources and seismic advances reshaping the investment outlook. And I know that there will be a few people coming in, so Felicia, if you are open to it, maybe you and I could just have a Q&A session as well, so that for those of us who are here can understand better. Please welcome Felicia onto the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, so I wanted to take you on a tour across East Africa, and the general theme is Basins Without Borders. As we so often talk about, geology doesn't stop at the political border, and I want to just give you a few examples of the subsurface in East Africa and why we need to understand across border, because for example, when you look at this map, it's not all of the wells, there are loads more wells, but there are wells in fields offshore East Africa. When we look at the north offshore Somalia, we have exactly one well in the offshore area. There are a couple more onshore with discoveries. But then when we look at the Ruvuma Basin at the Tanzania-Mozambique border, we do see quite a lot of wells, and as probably everybody knows, producing gas fields. But how come there is such a disparate in the density of the wells, for example? Do we not understand, or are the systems, is the geology changing? Do we not have the source rock? Things like that is important to understand. And it's also important to understand that wells offshore Kenya, for example, can help drive Somalia investment, because we don't have any volcanic ridges in between, we don't have any barriers. We do have a situation between Tanzania, Mozambique, and Madagascar that I will elaborate a bit later. Yes, the second thing I wanted to point out here is we do know gas is producing in the Ruvuma Basin, but there is quite a lot of oil in the system in general. And here are a few examples. The Sunbird well from 2014 by BG has found oil in carbonate reefs that are sourced from the Eocene. For example, the Anadarko Kiboko well in 2013, just before Sunbird, also found oil. And we do have oil in Tanzania in, for example, Pemba, Mafia, Nyuni. Then onshore Madagascar, we obviously have the heavy oils found just walking across the ridges there. So it is quite surprising that when we talk about East Africa, it is always shallow gas people are talking about. But we should not forget that there is an oil system, and maybe that is something for the future to consider. Why talk about East Africa? At this conference, we have Tanzania, Kenya, and Madagascar license rounds on the horizon. There are no dates yet, but that means there is momentum again and there is interest again. And that's why we thought it's a good idea to show you a bit about East Africa. To understand better what it means, understanding the potential across the borders, it's probably a good idea to understand the tectonics. And we're going from bottom up on the right-hand side here. There is a failed Karoo Rift in East Africa between what is today island of Madagascar and Somalia-Kenya coastlines. Karoo Rift is Triassic times, and then we do see the opening of the Somali Basin, but Madagascar and India are moving south. So the rift in Somalia is actually then exchanged with an oblique motion towards the south. And at the very top, the Marian Plume in the south of Madagascar is believed to have initiated India on Madagascar splitting up. That is also when Madagascar is tilting, and that tilt created the outcrops where we have a ridge in the west of Madagascar today where we can walk across and heavy oil is seeping out. Why I wanted to show this is because at a certain time, and that is when we're looking at the reconstruction on the left-hand side, at Aptian-Barremian times in the early Cretaceous, we do see that we have a restricted ocean here, and that means we do have source rock deposition. That is the second phase that happened in East Africa, because we do have a Jurassic timing as well, where we had a restricted ocean and an anoxic organic event deposited there, which you can see on this map. What also happened in mid-Jurassic is that because of the restricted ocean, we also have shallow water depths. That is not always the case. In the North Atlantic, for example, we had at a certain time in the Jurassic a restricted ocean, organic material deposited, but it wasn't shallow enough for a large amount of carbonates to settle in the Jurassic. The carbonates in West Africa come later, that is Cretaceous times. So this is very, very unique to East Africa, that we have a huge carbonate reef system at Jurassic times. Right, let's jump right in. The Juba-Lamu Basin is across the border, Somalia to Kenya. So that's right hitting up the LA Basin Without Borders. And I just want to give you a few examples. Because we only have one offshore well in Somalia, offshore Somalia waters, I wanted to show you this because we do see quite a lot of evidence that gas or hydrocarbons, fluids are in the system with pockmarks, high amplitudes that indicate shallow gas, as you can see here, on seismic 2D lines. We even, when we're mapping out some of these stacked reservoirs in thrust and fold belts offshore, a bit further south in Somalia, these toe thrusts in the middle here, left-hand side, you can see what we think is an oil-water contact or a gas-water contact, depending on the maturity of the source rock. And these are actually detaching on shales that could as well be a Cretaceous source rock. A few other things that we see that are quite specific for the Somalian side in the Juba-Lamu Basin is that we do have the extensional system where these toe thrusts are coming from is almost onshore. It's around coastline, so we don't really capture the extensional faults on the seismic in the offshore. But this is a line where we can actually see the rollover anticline, and for that anticipate this detaching on a listric fault. And I wanted to show you this because, again, we have the impression, it's on 2D seismic, admittedly, that we might be seeing hydrocarbon water contact here in the anticline, but also the sheer size of this rollover anticline. So just the tip of the closure that you see where the oil water contact is indicated on the seismic is 75 square kilometers. So if there is a stacked potential in here, which we may just not see because it's 2D seismic only, could be a lot larger than this. When we move slightly further south, we do have these toe thrusts in Kenya as well. So that is what the Lamu Delta is called, what Somalia and Kenya are sharing, coming from the onshore to the offshore. And as you see here, in tertiary times, by that age, the toe thrust system is not onshore anymore, it's pushed out offshore, and you see a huge transport system there detaching in the shallow sediments. If it rings any bells, the Kuba well in Kenya looks exactly like that, is tagging that system in the Lamu Delta. Which brings me to this slide. So you do actually see there are stacked fold and thrust belts. We have a large one at the center here in the Cretaceous. And again, it looks like there are stacked reservoirs with interim seals, as we believe. But then you have a smaller, younger system detaching over the top of it. This is also a good sign because it tells us there are shales in the system. So at least we do have the regional seals working. And maybe best case, we do have additional source rocks. Remember the map of the discoveries in the beginning. In the Sunbird well has found oil from an Eocene source. So that is round about the level where we have the shallow detachment here. So that's why it's so important to understand across the border what is happening to properly connect the dots. When we're talking about Somalia, I mentioned the Merrick well 1 is the only offshore well here. That is not, strictly speaking, quite true. We do have TSTP wells. Obviously, those are not exploration boreholes, but they do give us more information on lithology and the organic material in the basin. What you see here on the map is the multi-client data coverage. You have offshore Somalia, so we have heard in the farm-out meetings on Monday that there is currently 3D undergoing, so this is why we are talking East Africa. It seems the momentum is there, and the focus is back on something that doesn't quite fit Basin Without Borders is these kind of structures are very specific for the northern bit of the Somali basin. You see we are at the Merrick well location, and we have the Sin Rift on the left-hand side of the seismic. Is quite shallow. So this is uplifted after it has been rifted. And that is the time, maybe you remember the map at the beginning, where Jurassic carbonates and reef system have extensively been built in that area, and that is quite unique for East Africa across the basins, but that we have extremely thick, more than one phase. We mapped 2, but it might be 3 different phases of Sin Rift growth sequences that are uplifted. And on the inset map, you see here that we also presume source rocks to be present in these. So you have a specific system in the Sin Rift that can be tagged Jurassic age, that is at a relatively shallow target depth to drill. Just to zoom in, we have been asked in the past, how do you know that these are carbonates? I mean, it's just 2D seismic. This is a cross-section across, and if you look at the blue shaded features here, you do see the canyons. And these are incised clastics coming across the shoreline, the carbonate buildup shoreline. So basically anything that then comes out of the lagoon when the water levels are rising again and the platform is slowly drowned in the early Cretaceous time. These are quite extensive, and I want to draw an analog from offshore the Philippines here. Those are Oligocene, so it's quite a different age. Carbonates, but they have been tested with wells drilled, reservoir quality, and they are relatively large. And as you can see, the ones that this is just a sub-portion of the reefs that we have mapped is a lot larger offshore Somalia. Right, when we move south to Kenya, this is the data coverage, multi-client data, a few proprietary 3Ds. There is a bit more than this available on proprietary basis. But as you see, we are covered quite well with data. That also means we understand a bit better than in Somalia what targets we have. And marked here on the right-hand side, for example, is a small rollover anticline. But I want to point out this is associated again with these big fold and thrust belts pushing out in the Lamu Basin, but we are a bit further south. So it is not a fold and thrust belt from the Lamu Delta, but the movement, the gravitational push in the shallower reservoirs, as you can see here, is still there. So basically we are talking about slightly further south of the border to Somalia, the Tembo Trough. And as you can see here, again, the extensional faults are visible here now. Remember, in Somalia, we had them onshore. Now they're pushing a bit further offshore. And then we have an uplift, reactivation of faults in the Simba High. But to the west of it, on the left-hand side, we do have the extensional system. So that is what was missing in Somalia onshore, offshore. We have additional traps here in Kenya that are not to be found offshore Somalia. So that is the difference. But to go back to the basins without borders, the Rufiji and Ruvuma Delta are also being shared. And I want to talk about, just briefly, that you have it in your head, what it looks like on the maps. Because this is quite a regional sediment input. On the left-hand side here, you can see Tanzania and Mozambique border at the center of the map here. The Ruvuma Delta is across the border almost exactly. And as we all know, this is where a lot of gas discoveries have been made. And we're talking about shallow gas production fields. What sometimes does get a lot less screen time is the Rufiji Delta, but it is not to be underestimated. There is extreme sediment input coming from that side. And on the top right, you do see some of these fans pushing out, coming from these deltas, having been drilled in the past. And at the bottom there, we do see different structures. Those are channels. They have not been drilled. So there is a lot of sediment coming in, so that the geometries actually keep differing throughout the Cretaceous, what kind of turbidite targets we are finding offshore. And since we're talking about deltas, fans, and channel systems as the examples just before, all of this is really combined in what we all know, the Mamba complex, and that is because the bottom currents are redirecting our turbidite flows that bring in the reservoir into these stacked channels with the drift sequences to one side that you can see on the green here. The yellow are your sands, and the finer grains then are draping to the other side. So that is very, very typical the moment we get to the south, across the border, Tanzania to Mozambique. But remember this, we have a fold and thrust belt, toe thrust belt. We have gas discoveries here. You see the Windjammer prospect here. That is just fans butting against those faults. So we're back to the theme of Basins Without Borders. We do have this as a very, very classic target, stacked target in East Africa. Right. The most interesting regional feature across borders in East Africa is our Sea Gap Fault, Karimbasgraben, or Davy Ridge, depending on where you are, offshore which country you are. And this is not even regional. I would call it an uber-regional feature that is guiding and imprinting what traps we are looking for in East Africa. Here you can see a reconstruction to mid-Cretaceous times. And so we do see what was deposited as sand and shale in the system quite a lot. There are some carbonates here at the end of the Jurassic. That is what we were talking about earlier in Somalia. But now we are in the clastic system. And you can see the indication here of the Ruvuma Delta on the little map. Start with the Sea Gap. You can see that here just left of the labels, that is basically the regional Sea Gap fault. It is hard to tell sometimes if you only have a few couple of lines in 2D because there are a lot of strain faults. They have nothing to do with the transfer Sea Gap fault. But where you see the rollover anticline, that is where the regional sea gap fault is. So this is a feature that is driving the targets. Almost everything that is chased outboard now has something to do with trapping against the fault, being a rollover anticline, being assuming migration along that fault. So your entire system really relies on the sea gap fault to make it work. And just to relate it back to the map, inboard of that sea gap fault, that's where the shallow gas discoveries were made. These are our fields. So there is a lot outboard of that fault that hasn't been discovered or tested indeed. So there is quite a lot of potential here. Which brings me to another example here. This is a rollover anticline that actually closes off in 4 directions. So quite typical again because of the sea gap fault. These are the targets that you can see operators have been chasing, but not quite drilled yet. The moment we move a bit further south, we are looking at the Karimbas Graben all of a sudden. So targets along the sea gap fault, that is Kenya and Tanzania, Zanzibar, are still similar here because we obviously have the regional faults either side of the Karimbas Graben. But what happens is the Karimbas Graben itself is offering a different play because of a different maturation of any organic material that is inside the Karimbas Graben and buried a lot deeper than if there was no graben. So what we do know is, again, to the left-hand side, inboard of this graben, are quite a lot of discoveries. That is what has been tested, that is what is quite well understood. The source rocks are believed to use these faults, and there is charge migration focuses along that graben and the inboard side. But what has not been tested and is still highly potential, if you understand the geology properly, is the outboard side of this. The water depths don't differ that much on the other side of the Karimbas Graben. But what you can see here when you're looking at the red horizon is the depth to source rock is slightly different. So that is something that we haven't quite understood yet. Until someone drills, it's all a bit of a mystery. So here you see a bit of a zoom in to the Karimbas Graben with a bit more seismic kilometers on the left-hand side. That is to the west, closer to the shoreline. And once again, we are back to the toe thrust, fold and thrust belt, classic target for us from the north to the south in East Africa. These have been tested. These are the gas fields. So again, on the right-hand side, we have 4.5 kilometer burial to what we consider the rift sequence. So we really shouldn't have a reason to believe that source rock maturation is not possible outboard of the graben. But again, there is a bit of a reluctance. It hasn't been tested yet. We are awaiting brave operators to give us the news at some point. When we move even further south, we are offshore Madagascar now. This looks like the Karimbas Graben is continuing, and that is because we have flattened the section to late Cretaceous times. And it's actually looking like that. So what happened is we kind of have the remnant of the Karimbas Graben being inverted, overturned, and uplifted when the whole Cretaceous crust is moving south together with Madagascar and India continents. What you see here is obviously a bit of a squished section, and on the right-hand side of the seismic we do see a huge basin bowl. That is the Morondava Basin west, offshore Madagascar. And the interesting bit here is we don't have any oceanic crust in that basin because it never actually properly broke up and opened up. If you remember the maps at the beginning, Madagascar and the offshore basin, they are just slowly moving south along what's called here now the Davy Ridge. On the left-hand side, left of the ridge in the west, you do have oceanic crust, and that is offshore Mozambique. So the interesting bit here is, although these days Mozambique and Madagascar are conjugate margins, they are not originally conjugate margins in Jurassic and Cretaceous times. What I wanted to point out here is there are fracture zone-induced leads. So now that we've moved away from the Carimbas Graben, what we don't have anymore are the large fold and thrust belts coming from the onshore. That's simply because we don't have those sediment input systems anymore. We don't have the large deltas because we're offshore Madagascar now. But the Davy Ridge is helping sediments that were deposited in the Morondava Basin west of the Madagascar island have been squeezed, squashed, and folded, as you can see here, by the movement south, because we're looking at it a bit like scissors is getting tighter and tighter and tighter along the Davy Ridge. That's why the Carimbas Graben has then been squeezed up into an inverted structure. But what we also get is the younger sediments here, like Cretaceous, are starting to make use of the Davy Ridge to trap. There is a lot of these rollover anticlines, and it looks a bit like we have fold and thrust belts here, but that is really quite different, tectonically induced by the fracture zone. And then if you're moving further south, what happens is that the Davy Ridge actually is combined with the Madagascar coastline at some point. So the southern tip of Madagascar is the end of the Davy Ridge as we know it, not of the fracture zone. The fault is continuing. But as you can see here, left-hand side is a bit further north, right-hand side is a bit further south. It becomes a lot tighter, and it is quite volcanic at this stage. The crust is intruded by basalt dikes, and there is a lot of sills happening now, as we can map on gravity magnetic as well as seismic. Right, we're stepping a tiny bit further north again, but we are looking at the volcanic portion of the Davy Ridge. I'm just looking across the ridge now into the Mozambique area, and as mentioned earlier, we do have oceanic crust offshore Mozambique because that opened long before Madagascar actually moved south. So it's a bit of an odd one that continental crust from offshore Madagascar is slowly squishing up against Mozambique transitional and oceanic crust. So what looks here like it could almost be a mini subduction zone, we wouldn't call it that because the connotation of a subduction zone is quite wide-ranging, mantle involved, and we don't really have the length of kilometers for that mechanism. But what you see here is basically soft, viscous oceanic crust that hasn't quite cooled yet, that gets squished up against transitional, almost continental crust that is stronger, more brittle, and that's why the oceanic crust is kind of ducking a bit underneath and folded underneath. That is what the Davy Ridge looks like in the south. And as you can see, Mozambique, although we are quite far offshore already, the basin floor fans in the Jurassic, Cretaceous, and even Tertiary, as indicated with the reservoir blobs here, they are making use of the Davy Ridge quite a lot in the east as well. So that is an important trapping mechanism offshore Mozambique. When we zoom in, you do see that the contorites are taking over in the late Cretaceous, Tertiary times. You will find the sands in between, so the channel system are guided by the big mounds of the contorites. But again, before that, the Tertiary, the late Jurassic and Cretaceous fans are trapping to the southeast because of the Davy Ridge. The inside map at the top right, again, just to remember, is that is the restricted ocean that gives us so many levels of source rocks in the area. That is also true from Mozambique in Jurassic and Cretaceous times here. Right, I'm just jumping back briefly to Tanzania and wanted to zoom in so you see what data is available offshore. it's quite beneficial offshore Tanzania compared to Kenya and especially Somalia. We have a lot of 3D already shot. It's quite a good coverage. There is multi-client data currently available, so should the license round be announced in the next months, that is what you can work with. We have marked a couple of wells here, so it is tested through various levels. And obviously, if you're interested in a bit more detail, don't hesitate to get in touch. But I just wanted to bring up a few discoveries because offshore Tanzania, we have been quite successful so far. So we're looking here, total recoverable, 5 TCF, total recoverable, 800 million barrels of oil, gas equivalent, 6 BCF, that's the Papa well. If you look at the left-hand side, there is just a 2D line. And I'm not sure whether everybody agrees, but we do see the flat spots here. And then undrilled, you can see various stacked channel systems in the Cretaceous. Then when we get shallower to the late Cretaceous tertiary times, you do see fans, ponding. There is a lot that has not been drilled. And due to the wells, we do understand the reservoir quite well. Last but not least, I just want to give you these maps to indicate why are we talking about Basins Without Borders. We have quite a lot of data offshore Tanzania, and this is a map that gives us everything we need to know away from the exploration wells. You have an exploration well, you have your geochemistry signature, you have the source rock age, you can map it on that seismic, and then you get the changes in sediment thickness for your source rock maturation and your possible net target. Right, that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention.